So, three quick disclaimers before we get going. The first is I apologize horribly for using a really corny template. I never do this. I'm so sorry. It was a really easy template to use, and it was like social justice-y, and it met the vibe, but I apologize still for subjecting you to it. Two other actual more kind of serious things, and then we'll get started. First, I think that especially with broader topic areas like social justice, for example, it can be kind of unclear like what the purpose of these things, like these presentation things, is supposed to be. So there's basically three things that I have in mind in terms of hoping to give you within this. The first is just a kind of broad overview of major social movements, what their goals are, what they look like, what their composition is, etc. A lot of this will probably be very basic review for some folks. Maybe it'll be more interesting slash new slash exciting for others. The second thing I'll try to do is provide more strategic advice on making arguments about social justice and debate that go beyond just knowing what movements are or what they might fight for. And the kind of last thing I'll deal with is illustrations, examples, like what this looks like in reality, stuff like that. Third and final disclaimer, even though it says disclaimer number 2, is obviously like I am a white dude. I don't claim to speak on behalf of or for these movements. Obviously, it's very good to do your own research and also to read about the actual experiences of activists, of people within these groups. So I'll try to recommend readings or things that you can Google that might be interesting throughout this. But obviously, it's always a good thing to read actual stuff that's coming from these groups as opposed to what some person a la me says. But with those kind of disclaimers out of the way, there's kind of 4 big oops, I forgot to get rid of those things, so you can ignore those. But basically the gist of what we're going to cover is 4 major movements I think come up the most frequently in debate. Depending on timing, we might also chat a little bit more about indigenous activism potentially. And then at the end of that, this will be the first half of the presentation. The second half of the presentation will focus mostly on applying abstract social justice stuff to debates and making arguments, stock arguments, characterizations, stuff like that, etc. Okay, we'll get started. So first off is feminism, and kind of like, I think that feminism tends to be the most commonly debated, at least in Canada. So it's a good thing to chat about. So quick overview just on the kind of historical background for feminism. A lot of this isn't vitally important for debate, but it's cool and interesting stuff to know, and it's not a horrible thing to be familiar with. So we'll quickly kind of blitz through some of this stuff. The main gist is that contemporary feminism, at least in the West, as is often debated, largely is divided into sort of 3 dominant waves. A lot of the feminism which existed prior to those 3 waves is called proto-feminism, but a lot of the foundations of contemporary feminism were very much laid by prior feminists. So one of the main critiques you'll hear of the conception of feminism as being divided into 3 or 4 waves is that it suggests a sort of linear approach to feminism, like you had one wave, then a second wave, then a third wave, when in reality there was a lot of work which existed prior to any of those 3 waves that kind of built up to where feminism is at the present moment. But no matter what wave or era of feminism you're talking about, the main goal of feminism is to eliminate a lot of the kind of current existing structures around patriarchy. And in doing so, the kind of goal is to enable women to access the opportunities and powers that men have access to and currently are given on a sort of unfair and unequal grounding. So in terms of what those 3 or 4 waves look like, the first wave is the wave that you probably talk about in history class and like flunk your history test on, because it's just kidding. It's very interesting. But the gist of first wave feminism is it basically primarily focused on legal rights for women, the most obvious of which is the right to vote. So it turns out that when Tommy Jefferson was writing his old Declaration of Independence thing, and he was like, all men are created equal, apparently they weren't, because women were not, I don't know, the WO changes something, I guess, or whatever. But the gist basically is first wave feminism focuses primarily on giving suffrage to women. Second wave feminism originates several decades later. Second wave feminism still exists to a large extent, in the sense that there's still second wave feminists or people who identify as second wave feminists. Second wave feminism focused more so on what are called de facto inequalities. So first wave feminists were like, yo, man, we don't have the right to vote and men do. That's very sexist. That's a very obviously identifiable legalized form of sexism, so to speak, in the sense that de facto is just like it exists within the law. Like there is a law that says men have X, women do not have X. The rise of second wave feminism sought to focus, de facto is inequalities that do not actually exist, at least literally in the text word of laws, but exist very much in reality, i.e. as a matter of fact. So de facto sexism is sexism that might not, for example, have like a law that says women are not allowed to behave in this way, or women are not allowed to access these opportunities, but there's still very much so inequalities that exist. There's obviously a blend between those two. So for example, I was shocked when I found this out. Does anyone know the first year that Yale University began accepting female students? You know, everyone's like big, oh, Yale, Ivy, ooh, Yale. Anyone want to guess when Yale first began accepting women? Oh, wait, what was that, Jared? Sorry, go ahead. Oh, wait, my mic is probably shot. Hang on. Give me 1 sec. Let's see if I switch my speakers up. Wait, can someone say something and let me see if my audio is totally destroyed? And if so, then I guess I'll have to.
Hello,
Oh.
hello.
Oh, wait, now I can hear you. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Emily.
Sorry, I didn't have a guess.
Okay, cool. Someone that did have a guess, feel free to take a shot. Okay, can anyone else hear anything, or is that like just me? It's possible it's just me. It's very plausible it's actually just me.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Okay. Anyways, I actually forget the exact year, but the gist is it was like the 1960s. Which, like, just think about it for a second, guys, is like crazy. Like Yale, 1960s. It's crazy. I know. It's insane. Anyways, so the kind of role of second wave feminism was primarily focusing on inequalities that existed socially and existed in terms of norms, even if they were not officially grounded theoretically within law. There's a lot of literature that sort of is the precursor to this. But the main gist of second wave feminism is that there's a greater emphasis placed upon things like the way women are generally treated in society, the way they're expected to behave within the nuclear family, the way they're denied access to educational opportunities, the way that they're expected to act in terms of the way they dress, present, the sort of being forced into domestic roles, etc. Second wave feminism places a large degree of critique upon those types of institutions and opposes those types of practices and social norms. Now, there's a lot of good things that ends up coming out of second wave feminism. For example, you have a lot of protections established, especially within Western countries, for contraception, for abortion, for educational and athletic opportunities for women. There's also a lot of very good opportunities that are advanced for women within other fields, and you start to see more and more women entering into the workplace. Eventually, I think it's by 2011 is the first year that there are officially more women than men in college. But at the same time, the perhaps largest issue with second wave feminism is that a lot of the focus of first wave feminism is centered around relatively more privileged feminists. This is a theme called intersectionality. I'll be chatting about a lot tonight, but there's a really kind of like flashpoint moment of this late in the 1960s, where basically there's a piece of legislation in the United States that's passed that basically was designed to increase employment and vocational opportunities for Black Americans in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And there's a huge debate that happens within what's called the NOW, the National Organization for Women, where their founding member, who also published the Feminine Mystique, which is largely credited with the starting of second wave feminism, basically puts out a memo that says, we should use this new piece of legislation to give more employment opportunities to women. And it's very widely controversial within the NOW internally, largely because there was a lot of debate amongst, for example, Black women who identified as feminists within the movement, who opposed that ideology for fear of the opportunities that might end up taking away from the Black community in general, and why that might end up being harmful on an intersectional basis in the ways in which different forms of oppression compound upon one another. That then leads nicely into third wave feminism, which is a more direct response to that lack of intersectionality. So third wave feminism emerges largely in the 90s, generally 1992 or so, probably 1994, depending on who you talk to. And third wave feminism is much more ideologically diffuse compared to first or second wave feminism. So the goals of first and second wave feminism are fairly clearly grounded. First wave feminists focus a lot on suffrage. Second wave feminists focus on a large number of social norms and a large number of expectations of women that are deemed as being harmful. Third wave feminism places a greater emphasis upon the ways that different forms of oppression overlap and places a greater degree of emphasis upon notions of female individuality. This ends up creating, interestingly, a lot of internal disagreements between second and third wave feminists on very specific instances where there is kind of some degree of tension between the ideologies of second and third wave feminists, which we'll chat about in a second. But the kind of perhaps largest victory of third wave feminism is the increasing focus on non-white conceptions of feminism. So for example, trans feminism, so for example, indigenous feminism, and the increasing focus on more vulnerable or more disprivileged voices, even internally within the feminist movement. So the fourth wave of feminism also ends up arising. Some people will tell you this does exist. Other people will tell you it doesn't exist. No one it's just a phraseology thing at some point. But the main gist of fourth wave feminism its most obvious manifestation has been the MeToo movement, which is something we'll chat about in a second. But the sort of fourth wave of feminism has seen a particularly large emphasis placed upon issues like sexual harassment. This has also been particularly evident with things like, for example, the election of Trump, the appointment of Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and lots of those kind of institutions, around sort of problematic norms around female sexuality and all of that, which we'll chat about more in just a second. So those are kind of the main four dominant waves of contemporary Western feminism that doesn't account for a lot of the strides that have been made within, for example, feminists in the developing world, which we'll chat about in a bit. And it also ignores a lot of the ways in which, for example, like the queer movement embraced feminist ideology, or the ways, for example, in which the civil rights movement placed an emphasis upon the liberation of women. So there's a lot of overlap between different social movements. The sort of common-ish topic that gets debated a decent bit about is the Me Too movement, something I'm sure you're all familiar with. Quick historical context: the original phrase Me Too started in 2006. It really picks up, though, in 2017, late 2017, when Harvey Weinstein, who was a Hollywood producer, and he did films and lots of things. I don't know, I don't watch movies, but he basically has a very devastating article published in the New York Times that accuses over 80 accusations, 80 women accusing him of sexual assault or harassment. He gets arrested a few months later, and it kicks off this very large-scale movement, particularly on social media, for women to share their stories, to find support, validation, and all of that. And there's a lot of discourse sort of centered around this concept of the ways in which women are historically oppressed, especially within the workplace, especially when it comes to things like sexual harassment. There's a lot of instances where the Me Too movement has succeeded. So there's roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 200-ish very powerful men who are generally like widely kind of publicly identified as being clear instances where the Me Too movement sort of dethroned someone or took them down from a position of power. So, for example, Matt Lauer was a very powerful media mogul within NBC, ended up being ousted from his position at the Today Show after accusations of sexual harassment. Lots of politicians have as well. But obviously, there's also lots of instances in which people have been very credibly accused of sexual harassment and nothing has happened. We'll chat about that in a second. Very arguably, though, the greatest, perhaps, argument as to why the Me Too movement has succeeded is that a lot of the initial sort of rhetoric around Me Too was not per se focused on identifying and then removing specific people from specific positions, as much as empowering women to share stories and support each other. And that has also resulted in some degree of grassroots change. So, for example, admittedly some more liberal states, but even if you just look in the United States, if you look at states like California or New York, there's been a lot of legislative reform that's taken place in those states that have sought to do things like, for example, give women more of an ability to speak out when they're sexually harassed. There's been an increased emphasis upon, for example, reforming the ethics structure of Congress. For some bizarre reason, aka sexism, Congress has a bunch of really fucking stupid rules that make it really, really difficult for congressional staffers to report sexual harassment because Congress gets to write the laws and Congress doesn't want harassers within Congress to get accused. So the gist is Congress has done some reform there. And there's also been a greater focus placed upon compensation for victims of things like sexual assault. At the same time, there's a lot of reasons why there have been critiques levied against the Me Too movement. And when I say critiques, I don't mean like backlash, like, fuck you. I mean like credible reasons for why like the movement hasn't done everything it set out to achieve. Probably the largest argument as to why the Me Too movement didn't necessarily meet the burden it set for itself is that a lot of the change that came from the Me Too movement has been somewhat limited. And to be clear, any change is good change, but a lot of people have very reasonably argued that we need a lot more change. And so that's why, for example, like Donald Trump has like an enormously horrifyingly large number of women who have accused him of sexually harassing them that have basically more or less gone largely unheard within popular political discourse in the United States. But even beyond that, a lot of the instances where men have been removed from power have been very high profile cases, which is fantastic. But one of the larger critiques of the Me Too movement is that it hasn't necessarily been as effective for relatively poor women who don't have the media clout or the international outcry that happens when very powerful people are accused of something going wrong. So, for example, if you're a waitress and you are sexually harassed by your boss, there's a lot of benefit that Me Too provides in the context of being empowered to share your story. But in lots of instances, the massive outcry of support and the massive outcry of anger and demands for X person to be fired, those don't necessarily always manifest at a more local or non-national level, which has kind of been one of the perhaps larger critiques of the movement. The other sort of obvious thing that has happened with Me Too is that basically whenever anyone ever tries to do anything that's even vaguely good for women, there's always a bunch of men who are very pissed off about it. Now, Me Too is interesting because it's a fairly decentralized movement. So it doesn't have a very clearly identifiable figurehead in the sense that maybe you could pinpoint Weinstein's downfall as the beginning of the movement, but it's not obviously clear if you could say that there is this person who is the head of the movement. That's meant that some of the backlash against Me Too has also been fairly decentralized, but perhaps like a lot of sort of scholarly, expertly people who are much smarter than me have kind of framed the more recent Johnny Depp Amber Heard case as maybe a kind of interesting example where a lot of the sexist opposition to Me Too has sort of found a place to come out into the open. And so you've seen a lot of people who have used the Depp versus Heard case as their kind of rallying cry to attack or bash the Me Too movement. And that's why a lot of the rhetoric against Amber Heard, regardless of your personal stance on the case, has been very explicitly demonizing, largely because a lot of people view this as sort of implicit response to Me Too and the things that Me Too sought to accomplish. We won't prep this motion because I kind of chatted about this, but this motion was set at a relatively large college tournament about 2 or 3 years ago. Kind of an interesting motion in case you want to ever prep something related to feminism. It's a fact motion, so exactly what it means to have failed women is obviously open to debate, but certainly interesting idea nonetheless. The next thing I'm going to chat about within the broad area of feminism is basically disputes within feminism. These are often issues that come up in debates over what the priorities or the goals of the feminist movement should be. There's 2 broad types of disagreement. There's disagreement over what the end goals of feminism should be. And there's also, and this is true for every movement, disagreement over the way that we get to those ends and the mechanisms that the feminist movement uses to accomplish its outcomes. The first large divide within contemporary feminism is a divide over choice feminism. It's not really contested within feminist circles that women are subject to socialization that tries to pressure women into doing certain things. So almost no feminist will tell you that there aren't sexist norms that try to encourage particular courses of behavior or action from women. Where disagreement ends up arising is basically in the context of choice feminism. And what choice feminism basically more or less says is that any female choice, even if that choice could credibly be accused of being influenced by sexism, is intrinsically empowering. And to be clear, that's not the only thing that choice feminism means. So different people would define choice feminism in a different way. But the kind of main premise of choice feminism is that if a woman makes a decision that makes her happy or gives her some sense of fulfillment, even if we as other feminists or as other people might oppose that decision and say, this was clearly just you abiding or kind of bending to patriarchy, as long as that woman makes that choice, at least consciously of her own free volition, we shouldn't oppose that choice. This is something that second and third wave feminists are not fully in agreement on. the kind of dominant trend within contemporary feminism is to favor a conception of choice feminism, but there are also a lot of feminist scholars who are somewhat opposed to choice feminism. That can range in sort of intensity. So for example, there might be some women who will say things like, I disagree with your decision, but you do you get to make your own choices, etc. That might be a more libertarian or relatively limited conception of feminism. There's also more hardcore variants of sort of anti-choice feminism, that more or less would place a greater degree of shame or negativity associated with those types of actions, say, for instance, becoming a housewife if you choose to do so, that are a bit more intense. There's a lot of classic arguments as to why choice feminism is good. The fact that, for example, shaming women is probably a really bad way to get them to start doing less sexist things. And probably just the fact that individual women do know what's in their own best interest, and maybe that's an actively good thing to give them that agency. And the feminist movement has something of an obligation to uphold the choice and agency of women. There's also arguments you can make as to why it's bad. The second, and I think kind of more contemporary divide in feminism is basically over lean-in feminism. So anyone know who I guess I said who Sheryl Sandberg is, so that was a stupid question, but Sheryl Sandberg she's stepping down recently of late, but she was the chief operating officer at Facebook and published a very controversial book in 2013 called Lean In. And basically, this is a book that advocates for what she calls lean-in feminism, which a lot of it is relatively uncontroversial. But the most controversial part of the book is basically a section where she advocates that more or less, if you're a female employee working in a fairly male-dominated environment, the best thing that you can do is to basically lean into that environment. There's a lot of reasons why people have criticized that. So the most common criticism is basically that for lots of women, the idea that you can just like lean into your male-dominated bro culture-y company and succeed just isn't possible. And you need to advocate for a more collectivist conception of feminism that emphasizes the collective power of women to overturn or kind of defeat those underlying structures of oppression. The argument that's generally made in favor of lean-in feminism is that getting even a few women to succeed within the relatively patriarchal corporate hierarchy ends up creating sort of quote unquote trickle down benefits to other women. So for example, maybe you get one female CEO at a tech company that then reverberates to the rest of the corporate structure. You get other female middle managers, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously that's come under criticism as well. So second kind of like dominant area of division within a lot of feminist discourse is centered around the concept of lean-in feminism and its merits and detractions. This is a cool quote. You can read it later. It's from a software engineer. The third thing, and this is probably, I don't think that this gets debated almost at all in high school, but it gets debated a decent chunk at college. They're called the porn wars, the sex wars, depending on who you talk to, which is admittedly a kind of funny name, but arguably by far one of the largest disputes between second and third wave feminism is basically over the issue of female sexualization. And I want to emphasize there's like no right answer on this. Like I'm just trying to give you guys a sense of context here. But the main gist basically is that there's two dominant schools of thought when it comes to things like pornography, porn, prostitution. Why did I say pornography and then porn? That was redundant. You get the gist though. So there's basically two schools of thought. The third wave feminist train of thought, which is also sort of the choice feminism train of thought, basically more or less says, if someone reclaims their sexuality or their sexualization in a way that they find empowering, this is something that should be supported, should be celebrated, should be glorified. The second wave feminist argument tends to more go along the lines that A, in many instances, these industries are inherently exploitative. The type of women, for example, who enter into fields like prostitution might not do so out of a genuine desire to be a prostitute as much as, for example, an economic sort of forced impetus to join the industry. And secondly, as sort of a second line of critique, there's arguably problems that arise when you have, for example, women who end up selling their bodies more or less to appease the male fantasy, to cater to male buyers, in the ways that ends up worsening the perception of women, but also at a more individual level, the ways in which that gives men power over women. So this is something that, again, doesn't get really debated a ton in high school, so probably not incredibly important, but a very interesting kind of ideological split within feminism. We're going to do kind of a weird example motion of this. So I wrote out like very brief sketches of our, I guess we can debate it here and we can write later, but this is kind of an interesting example of a motion that got set a few months ago. OnlyFans is like kind of a more like decentralized pornographic site. And basically, like, the question that a lot of feminists have raised on the issue of OnlyFans, for example, is like, to what extent is this actually consistent with feminist principles? So you can kind of imagine what the main arguments are, right? Which is like, the obvious gov argument is basically that this is something that many women find empowering. It's something that gives many women some degree of financial comfort. And there's an extent to which if someone wants to work in this sort of field, it's probably better than the alternatives. And there's an independent benefit that comes from that. The op that you can sort of envision is more along the lines of the kind of second wave-esque argument, which is that this is in very many instances just an exploitative form of patriarchy. It's in very many instances the thing that like leads women to selling their bodies in ways that end up harming them later down the road, etc. We're not going to do a full case on this or anything, but like anything that folks think we should, any other obvious arguments that we missed or things that folks want to add on to this? This is also an excuse for me to sip my water. So, okay. The next kind of like main dispute that comes up a decent bit within feminist debates is ideological splits internally within the feminist movement. So a lot of the kind of classic splits like radical versus more conservative feminism are pretty boring. Not boring in the sense that they're boring, like not interesting, boring in the sense that they're true of almost any movement. But there's a few more interesting kind of ideological splits within feminism. One of them is a theory called lesbian separatism. It's sometimes called feminist separatism, but it's often heavily advocated by lesbian feminist scholars. And the gist of lesbian separatism is basically it's a theory that says the only way that women are able to escape patriarchy is by fully distancing themselves from men. So as opposed to sort of the argument that's often used against lean in, or even within the lean in structure, like we shouldn't even be debating about whether you should be like leaning in or leaning out of male dominated work environments. We should be setting up entirely separate institutions, countries even maybe, or at least areas where only women exist, where only women operate. So the kind of like separatist argument, and this happens in other movements as well. For example, if you read about things like Black nationalism, the premise often is that if the situation of oppression is so particularly intense, the best solution is to simply like ditch that structure and move elsewhere. The other kind of main split I'll emphasize here is the difference between what's called equality and difference feminism. Difference feminism is basically a type of feminism that emphasizes counterintuitively the ways that men and women differ, but then either A, makes arguments as to why those differences are not morally significant, or B, makes arguments about why those differences are reasons why women ought be entitled to special protections or specific accommodations. Equality feminism is a differing way of approaching feminist advocacy, which more advocates for the idea that men and women are largely similar in the context that there is more. Oh, rip, it says my internet connection's unstable. I will put this in chat. Hang on. If I cut out, let me know. Boom. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. No, stop. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'll shut my camera off for a little bit so that my video doesn't die. That was a nonsensical statement. I'm sorry. I'm going to shut my camera off so that my video doesn't die, he says as he shuts his video off. Anyways, the other thing, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it because it's very interesting but very dense analytic literature. There's this concept called post-structural feminism, which is fascinating. I'd really encourage all of you to read it or read about it. And basically, there's a large degree of discourse related to this equality difference feminism thing over essentialization of gender. What the idea of essentializing gender basically means is whether or not we as a society, but also as feminists, associate specific traits with specific gendered identities. The idea of post-structural feminism, which has become much more mainstream within the era of third wave feminism, is basically that gender is not a determining factor that shapes how people act, and that a lot of the stereotypes or a lot of the traditional norms or behaviors that we associate as being traditionally feminine or traditionally masculine are just arbitrary social constructions that don't actually have meaning or value. This is kind of an interesting motion that I think is kind of funky to debate, and it sounds really weird, but the more you think about it, I think the more interesting it becomes. This is kind of a nice example of a motion that like kind of has some degree of, dispute between a more moderate conception of feminism as opposed to a more radical conception of feminism, which we'll chat about in a bit later. The other thing, and I've kind of chatted about this a decent bit, but the concept of intersectional feminism is something that I think is very useful to consider when making arguments. The idea of intersectional feminism basically is that one of the largest issues within feminist thought is that relatively privileged voices, so for example, wealthy or white or cis women, are often the voices who are heard the most. One thing you'll notice is that opponents of feminism will often use this tagline when trying to bash the feminist movement. So people will be like, oh, you're just a white woman who says that. There's bad faith attempts at using that phraseology. There's also good faith attempts. So if like someone says, oh, you're just like a white woman who's preaching feminism, that's often used as kind of like an implicit reason why feminism should be discredited. And that's often a bad faith argument. The good faith argument, of course, is that there are legitimate problems of intersectionality within feminist discourse. A really common example of this is university programs studying things like gender and sexuality studies. So on average, the types of universities that tend to have the money to fund really robust programs that study things like, for example, the history of feminism, tend to be wealthier universities. They tend to be more exclusive universities. They tend to be more privileged universities. And what that often means as a consequence is that the type of research or the type of literature that's produced often favors a relatively more wealthy or relatively more white sort of voice of feminism. And so especially whenever you're making arguments and debate about feminism, it can be very useful to think about how different types of women are affected by a policy, or how different groups of women might be impacted, or how different groups of women respond. And you can kind of make cool or interesting arguments about that. Anyone who Eva is? Anyone recognize that name if you've watched any university debate at all? Yeah, so Eva, she won the HWS round robin in 2020, and she has a fantastic article on intersectionality within feminism. I'll put it in the document or something because it's really fantastic and you should read it because it's very fun. Anyways, quick thing on religion and feminism. This is also cross-applicable to most of the other groups we'll chat about tonight, but a lot of secular feminism, which is fairly dominant in the West, is fairly explicitly opposed to religion. But given the relative dominance of religion within society, there's often a lot of feminist scholars who actively attempt to lean into religion or embrace religion when making arguments in support of feminism. So, for example, I think one of my favorite examples of this is that there's been really, really powerful feminist groups in Sri Lanka that have very heavily appealed to this sort of like 18th or 19th century Buddhist tradition of female monks. And it's been one of the most religiously powerful arguments that's been made within the Sri Lankan feminist movement, largely, or at least in part, because what it has sort of helped is to ground feminist advocacy in the language of religion. We'll chat about this a little bit later as well, but kind of a cool argument. Okay, so that was a like literally 30-minute introduction to feminism. So that's exciting. The next thing we're going to chat about is LGBTQ advocacy and queer activism, and kind of like queer theory, which I personally find fascinating. But before we do that, any questions that folks, oh, by the way, I should emphasize this. We're going to talk about how you apply all this stuff later, like how you, for example, go about like applying, abstract feminist principles to like actual debates. We'll get there, don't worry. Any questions on like history / principles of feminism so far though, or like thoughts that folks want to add? Gorgeous. Wow. Beautiful. Okay. Queer theory. I honestly think that this is like a fascinating part of academic literature, and just Google queer theory because there's some fascinating stuff. So the main gist is that queer theory aims to decategorize a lot of the very dominant norms that exist, especially around concepts that are binarized. So things like sexuality, gender, the way people self-identify, etc. There's this really, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but Josh Kemp, who is a fantastic debater from the London School of Economics, has a really wonderful lecture on queer theory and debating. And if you look them up, Josh has a fantastic like little section on this, so you can read / listen more about this. There's this kind of fascinating theory of like queer advocacy, which is that the queer movement is, of almost any social movement, the most regenerative in nature, largely because a very large premise of queer advocacy or LGBTQ advocacy is that they the goal is to basically break down or deconstruct very binarized norms that exist. But very counterintuitively, the way that you become palatable enough to deconstruct very dominant social norms is as a movement to box yourself into binarized or very densely constructed identities, which means that as your movement expands, you must define yourself in a way that goes against the principle of decategorization, which means that almost inevitably there's a kind of endless cycle of movements arising, becoming overly definitionalized, and then subsequently giving way to new movements that critique that definitionality and move in with a more decategorizational approach. So anyways, really interesting concept. You can read more about it. But the kind of like main gist of queer theory is there's a lot of emphasis upon the ways that very dominant heteronormative cultural norms exist and the importance of breaking those things down. Queer itself is a word that was first used and historically used to sort of oppress and demonize the LGBTQ plus community. It's since been reclaimed by a large number of members of that community. And one of the kind of biggest internal disputes within a lot of queer advocacy is the extent to which activists should push for what's called assimilationist politics. So one of the kind of main disputes within a lot of LGBTQ movements is to what extent do you peddle narratives like we are just the same as everyone else, or we can be, we can like, we're like, our goal is to like live fully normal lives. So for example, if you look at a lot of the rhetoric from a lot of LGBTQ scholars and activists leading up to the legalization of gay marriage in countries like the United States, a lot of the arguments that were made for why we should, for example, legalize things like gay marriage is often because like, at the end of the day, we just want to be able to get married and raise a family and have children just like you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But kind of, like interestingly, right, there's also an extent to which there's been some pushback against that in the context that there are other queer activists who will say things like, well, it is true that we want to legalize things like gay marriage, but is it really true that the reason we want to be telling people that you should legalize gay marriage is because we're just like you, because we're assimilated into a heteronormative society? So there's kind of a lot of interesting arguments that can be made around the political benefits that come from endorsing assimilation as opposed to the ideological trade-off that inherently has to sort of cut. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. There's two things I'll kind of flag here. The first thing is that there's a lot of really interesting intersections between queer theory and other forms of like social theory. So for example, queer Marxism is a really interesting kind of fusion of Marxist, like socialist ideology and sort of more like deconstructionist queer advocacy. So there's this like fascinating queer theorist, for example, who gave what is, I think, one of the coolest arguments that's generally made against kind of capitalist conceptions of property, which is that most arguments as to why people have a right to property is that you own your kind of own identity. And as an extension of that, the things that you, for example, work for, or the things that you produce, or the things that you buy, you have some sort of moral entitlement to. And there's this kind of interesting intersection of queer and Marxist theory that says, well, is it truly actually correct that we ever quote unquote own our own identities, given the multiplicitous external factors that construct our identities and who we are as people? So there's kind of like interesting stuff there where there's like interesting intersections. But the bigger thing I'll quickly emphasize here, and this is less about queer theory than the kind of usage of queer theory within political discourse, homo-nationalism is the thing that you'll sometimes hear about in debate or used as an example. And it's kind of counterintuitive to what you might think it is. So homo-nationalism is basically what happens when countries that are especially under attack for bad human rights track records and other things will oftentimes very publicly tout their pro-LGBTQ stance and use that as kind of rhetorical defense against any accusation that they are being oppressive. So Canada, Israel, United States are all examples of countries that do this. And oftentimes the way that liberal countries will attempt to justify not doing more good things for the queer community is by saying things like, well, in Africa, they kill gay people, and here you can be like legal, blah, blah, blah. And even if factually an argument is true, it's almost always used in bad faith because the implicit attempt of an argument of that ilk is almost always to detract attention from other very credible, wrongdoings that country is committing. I'll quickly kind of blitz through the kind of main history of queer activism that is good to be familiar with, and obviously feel free to like do more reading on your own time. But like, there's always been a very vibrant queer community throughout history, and there's a lot of very interesting studies, for example, that look at the way that characters have historically been like subtly written to sort of embrace sort of traditionally queer characteristics within literature. So even like Shakespeare, for example, is like widely known to have done this. But the more contemporary LGBTQ rights movement began, at least in the United States and in a lot of Western countries, more so around the 19th and 20th centuries. In the United States, more or less, the first official institution that was established to sort of promote gay rights was established in Chicago in 1924. By sort of the 1950s, there was an increasingly vocal LGBTQ movement and community. There was a series of setbacks against this, though. So, for example, the APA published a study that basically said that they categorized homosexuality as a mental illness. President Eisenhower banned gay individuals from more or less working in the federal government. And in response to that, a lot of sort of gay and queer individuals often end up forming subcultures and subcommunities that were fairly isolated from more heteronormative institutions. Really kind of odd but funny connection of sorts is that there was a really large like kind of underground connection between a lot of gay communities and, for example, gay bars and organized criminal enterprises like gangs or mafia families, for instance, because it was often the case that those two kind of like benefited from each other, not in a sinister bad way, just in a, like a, if you wanted to run a gay bar, but the state wasn't going to license you, you needed someone to help you run it. And so there's kind of an interesting mutual relationship there. But in the United States, the most widely recognized watershed moment, not just in the US LGBTQ rights movement, but also in a lot of Western European countries, happens in 1969. The Stonewall Inn is a gay club. It gets raided by the police in the early hours of the morning. A bunch of people there fight back. It becomes this 5-day-long protest. This subsequently incites a whole bunch of riots across the country. And more or less in response to that, a very, very powerful and very, very vocal and efficacious movement arises. Throughout the 1970s, there's a series of legal as well as legislative and judicial victories for the movement, but largely speaking, the largest victories for the movement end up coming more so in the early 2000s with, for example, Texas passing a law that more or less criminalized gay sex that ends up being struck down by the Supreme Court. 2015, Obergefell v. Hodges officially recognizes gay marriage in the United States. And subsequently, in 2016, Obama implements a policy that allows transgender individuals to serve in the military. Trump, because he's a dick, overturns that. On the 6th day of Biden's presidency, that was reinstated. Even though there are legal protections, though, for a lot, like even in a lot of more progressive Western European democracies, even in countries where there are legal protections for LGBTQ individuals, there's still a lot of obvious problems that exist. On the ground, discrimination is still very, very much a very real problem. There's obviously the threat, especially post-Roe, of Supreme Court potentially looking to attack precedents like Obergefell. And there's obviously also the issue of the LGBTQ movement is a uniquely diverse movement, not only because it cuts across a bunch of different class and racial and ethnic and cultural and religious lines, but also because not all groups within the LGBTQ movement necessarily benefit equally from certain protective measures. So, for example, Obergefell v. Hodges was a massive victory for the gay rights movement in the United States, but didn't, for example, do as much to protect the needs of transgender individuals who are at a disproportionately higher rate of things like mental health crises and are disproportionately more likely to, for example, be forced out of their homes or denied access to opportunities or jobs. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on a lot of those kind of, very, very crucial and important issues, et cetera. Jared's right. I think there's a small chance there's a Kahoot question on this. The US House yesterday just passed a law that officially codifies gay marriage as a legal right. It's shocking the number of Republicans who voted for it and against it, in the sense that I think it was like 57 Republicans voted for it. And the fact that only 57 Republicans voted for it is kind of horrifying. But there is obviously a lot of like political momentum behind that. Interesting thing I want to flag before we move on and start chatting about other movements, then eventually get into applying these movements to debate. A lot of the perhaps largest successes, especially for the gay rights movement, have interestingly come through courts, not necessarily through legislatures. So when most people think of social movements, and as a quick side note, almost every single argument you'll ever hear in any debate round about social justice is almost always an argument about legislative bodies like Congress or Parliament. Think about it. Almost all the arguments people tend to make are arguments like, we should do X thing because if we were to do X thing, it would increase our political palatability and get more voters on our side, blah, blah, blah. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be clear. But a lot of the largest successes that the LGBTQ movement has achieved have often come through judicial measures, like, for example, appealing or sort of ruling or trying to make courts rule against very homophobic or transphobic laws. Kind of an interesting trend to be aware of. So that was like a very rapid introduction to queer theory. I have a lot more. We're going to do a couple of example motions when we get to the second half of this presentation and start chatting a little bit more about the application of all of this in debate rounds. But any questions on queer theory and debating are kind of like the general applications it might have to rounds. Well, I guess we'll talk about that later too. So, okay, cool. Exciting. There we go.
I guess sort of my one thing, and this kind of applies to feminism as well, would be like what the different schools of thought within it. How do you sort of utilize those in order to maybe make arguments or shift the clash or conversation more towards a more favorable side or something, like using different schools of thought?
So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we start talking about how to apply this debate. But I think especially when it comes to things like queer theory, for instance, it can often be helpful to remind yourselves of what the overarching goals of movements are. And you can kind of use that to help inform a lot of your advocacy. So, for example, I think that I kind of have personally had some revelations about this, but if you approach motions about this house as the LGBTQ movement would XYZ, if you come in with the conscious mindset of the goal of the movement is not just purely political, there's also a part of the movement that is ideologically focused on deconstructing heteronormativity and stuff like that. Oftentimes thinking about the ideological and even just the historical foundation of the movements can often be quite useful. So we'll talk about this more when we talk about environmental activism, but that's often true for a lot of environmental activists. The origins of movements, why they were originally set up or created, often matter a lot when it comes to what things movements push for. So, for example, there were Protestant environmental movements formed in the 1890s that still exist today that are still very much devoutly supportive of a Protestant approach to environmentalism. So often thinking about the historical origins of movements can be kind of interesting when you're trying to characterize what movements want and why they want it. We'll talk more specifically about weighing between different conceptions of movements. So for example, do you embrace a more radical conception or anti-assimilationist conception, for example, of queer theory, or do you endorse a more assimilationist approach to politics? We'll talk about kind of how you make arguments about that, but I think almost always the kind of dominant clash basically is a clash between political efficacy and ideological purity. So in almost all debate rounds about social justice, not all of them, but a lot of them, the clash basically becomes, do we do the thing that is more ideologically insound, or do we do the thing that's more politically good for us? So for example, this house as the feminist movement would advocate against monogamy, something like that, right? A gov team might be able to prove that the norm of monogamy is bad for women, but you might then also say, as an op team, even if it's true that monogamy is ideologically oppositional to feminism, advocating against monogamy is politically horrible for you and you lose a bunch of capital. So in a lot of debates, the implicit clash that happens is, to what extent do we strive to be ideologically pure? To what extent do we strive to be pragmatically palatable? And you can obviously make arguments about kind of either of those, and we'll chat about that in a little bit. Excellent question, though. Okay. Racial equality and Black Lives Matter. So kind of just quick I was about to say quick framing. I'm such a debater, but quick context I think is useful. And this obviously is applicable to feminism and queer rights as well. But I think it's honestly worth consciously reminding yourself just how fucked up power structures are. like within everything, even within like debating, for example, power structures exist. But like the main gist, especially of movements that fight for things like racial equality, gender equality, sexual equality, is to identify where there are systemic exclusions of marginalized groups and why those exclusions exist and how we can rectify them. So the United States, like, is a country that is like horribly racist and has been throughout its history and continues to be today. And that manifests in a bunch of ways. It manifests economically, and it manifests politically. It manifests in terms of your access to services, but it also manifests in terms of things like the extent to which you are over-policed or over-incarcerated. But there's two other things I just want to quickly flag, because I know there's a lot of words on this slide. The first thing I just want to flag is it's often useful, just as a human being, but also as a debater, to think about the ways in which historical forms of oppression have continuing impacts. So, for example, in lots of instances, the reason why Black communities are poorer is not just because there are current day policies that make it harder for Black communities to accumulate wealth. It's also that white families and white communities have been accumulating wealth for like literally centuries. And the point at which Black communities were only able to even start accruing that wealth, even just a few decades or at most centuries ago, is a lot of the reason why present day inequalities are so intense, because present forms of oppression multiply with existing or sort of historical forms of oppression in ways that can be very problematic. The second thing, like I mentioned before, is that almost all debates about social justice, but also just social justice in general, involve issues of intersectionality. So, for example, Black men and Black women suffer in some ways and also are privileged in other ways. So, for example, if you are like male, you have a degree of privilege that comes from your status as a man, even if you're also oppressed along other axes, like, for example, your race, your sexuality, etc. So there is varying degrees and gradations of privilege and varying degrees and gradations of oppression, which are often very useful when thinking about what types of groups should we prioritize in debate. Okay, enough kind of like abstract, thoughts. Let's get into stuff. Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter movement is largely founded in 2013, but like just to be very clear, I think everyone should know this, but like it's not as if police brutality started in 2013. Much earlier than that. Like if you look back throughout more or less all of contemporary U.S. history, I'm going to send out a document later that has a longer history of Black rights or like Black American history and the way that rights have been taken away, etc. But like, there's a large extent to which this has been an ongoing issue in America for a very long amount of time. Since 2013, Black Lives Matter has been one of the larger movements, even though it's relatively decentralized, pushing for change. There's a few characteristics that are always good to keep in mind whenever you're arguing about BLM. The first is that it's highly decentralized and very heterogeneous. So unlike other social movements that might be a little bit more centralized or have clearly identifiable leaders, BLM often rallies around specific flashpoints, like, for example, the murder of George Floyd, but the movement itself is highly diffuse. It doesn't necessarily have a large degree of internal hierarchy, and there's a very large variety of the groups that support Black Lives Matter. The two most dominant groups are white progressives who ally with the movement and Black individuals who are themselves the victim of things like police brutality and the terrorization that happens as a consequence of that. The other thing just to note is that even though Black Lives Matter might be associated with certain phrases like, say, defund the police, the movement itself doesn't necessarily have official stances. There are some things the movement embraces more than others, but overarchingly, the movement is very diverse in terms of the types of things it advocates for. The other thing just to point out on the flip side of that is that BLM is also very integrated with other movements. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Free Palestine movement are both politically quite interconnected. There's also a very robust queer section of the BLM movement, and there's also a lot of integration between Black Catholicism and the BLM movement. So, for example, Black liberation theology, which is sort of a reading of the Catholic Bible in a way that heavily emphasizes notions of freeing Black people from chains of oppression, etc. There's been a large degree of integration between those two movements, at least at the level of, for example, individual Black pastors, churches, etc., holding or supporting BLM rallies. There's a few reasons why the BLM movement is not necessarily perfectly effective. Probably the most important one, or like the one that comes up the most in debate, is given the large degree of decentralization present within the movement, there's often a lack of centralized attention on specific agenda issues or specific end goals. And there's often a large degree of diffusion within the movement. The other kind of common critique of the movement from a socio-political capital perspective is that certain narratives, like defund the police, are very much in line with the ideological beliefs in the movement, but arguably in some cases can, for example, alienate centrist voters. We'll chat about that in a little bit. In terms of the issues that BLM is specifically focused on and kind of what it's trying to solve, one of the largest and most obvious ones is police brutality. There's a lot of reasons why police brutality continues to remain a really large issue, other than just the fact that police are racist. The first is what's called qualified immunity, which basically is a legal doctrine that's been present in the United States since the 60s. I want to say 66, but don't hold me to that. And what the doctrine of qualified immunity basically does, it basically says that if I'm a police officer and I commit some instance of abuse, it's very difficult to launch a civil lawsuit against me, even if I'm clearly in the wrong. And it makes it very, very difficult to launch individual lawsuits against individual cops. The second reason why it's very difficult to reform the police is because there's a lot of powerful societal institutions that support them. So, for example, lots of state constitutions have special bills of rights that literally only exist for police officers and entitle police officers to specific rights. One of those rights that's often overlooked but is shockingly important is that police officers have a very extensive what's called cool down period, which basically is a period of time after abuses have been committed and before interviews or investigations can begin, where basically cops can just figure out what story they want to set up. And I know this sounds trivial, but a lot of the time, the reason why that matters is that one of the common ways that you can determine whether someone's guilty, for example, is if you bring someone in for questioning and their story changes radically in the course of 48 hours, it's often a telltale sign that something happened that was problematic or wrong. It often doesn't happen in the context of policing because there is that cool down period inbuilt. Police unions, though, are probably one of the largest barriers to meaningful police reform. So this is kind of an ironic example because unions are generally very, very good in debate. This is one of the clear examples where they're not. Police unions basically make it very difficult to fire cops. There's a very high degree of bar required to meet for you to be able to remove cops. There's also other reasons why it's hard to hold police accountable, though. Pro-cop sentiment, propaganda, for example, as well as things like, like the pushback against BLM in the forms of things like Blue Lives Matter. There's also reasons more broadly why it's difficult to create reform. And I want to quickly note at a meta level, all of these things are good things to kind of brainstorm in prep for, like, if you're trying to make arguments about, for example, improving outcomes for Black Americans, you might ask yourself questions like, how can we combat, say, the private prison lobby? Or how can we combat, say, qualified immunity or police unions, whatever it happens to be? There's lots of reasons why, even when it comes to non-police issues, it's very difficult to get change. The existence of the prison lobby, the fact that Democrats are functionally the only party that a huge number of Black people will tend to vote for, which means that there's no real fear of people voting Republican. The fact that there is a majoritarian incentive for politicians to appeal predominantly to people of the majority background. And I think what's also oftentimes overlooked is the influence of media on public opinion. So at this point in time, the media field is becoming increasingly centralized and consolidated. A very small number of very wealthy individuals own a disproportionate number of media companies. So for example, think Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post. And that means that a small number of very powerful white people that have a lot of incentives to keep the status quo as is have an enormous amount of influence over the information that we consume. So we're going to do a quick, little, just to get some practice in, woohoo, yippee, hurrah, some nice little practice in on this motion. So we're going to do a quick little group prep on just this house is the Black Lives Matter movement regrets the rise of social media activism. So take 30 seconds to think about this. And then we'll share, prep gov, we'll say, because we're going to prep an op to this later. So take some time just to quickly think about generic gov arguments. Okay, that was not 30 seconds at all, but I like to count fast. So anyone want to share out initial ideas on potential arguments as to why the rise of social media activism has been net harmful for the movement? Anyone want to volunteer an idea?
Like misinformation? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we can say misinformation. So maybe we can say that like maybe the kind of gist is like, social media, kind of like facilitates the rapid spread of wrongful or incorrect information for sure. Yeah, Jeffrey.
I guess it could like water down their goals because a lot of people on social media, they don't want to be controversial and they wouldn't like post about stuff like defunding the police. They just like, I support like Black lives or something.
Yeah, so maybe we consider there's like something of a watered down incentive. You don't want to be overly controversial on social media and affect your public reputation too negatively. Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Other general thoughts on like things that we could argue? Yeah, Jeffrey. Oh wait, Emily, I meant. Sorry, your hand was still up. My bad.
Maybe nothing gets post on social media and expect something to get done, and like companies might take advantage of like they'll say that they support certain issues, but they don't actually put their weight behind it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So this is kind of performative, right? Companies do this to get a PR boost, but it doesn't end up meaning anything. And kind of like activism on social media, maybe doesn't translate into action. For sure. Anything else that folks want to add to this, just in terms of like a general sketch of a gov?
I don't know if this is kind of far-fetched, but I was thinking about like the thing that you're talking about with like media consumption and how it's controlled by like only a small group of privileged people. So like it gives to those people who may or may not actually like they might not they have control over how this movement is basically presented, right? So yeah,
for sure.
There might also be something to say just in like, I know you mentioned a lot of times there can be sort of a big rise in popularity with BLM surrounding a specific instance. But in the times whenever, like between instances, the presence of the movement on social media might have to like people on social media could sort of like, if they're trying to keep with that with BLM, but they're also going with sort of other trends in order to stay popular, it sort of like muddles the perception of the movement on social media because it's now being associated with all these other trendy things. I don't know. My brain is really tired, so
No, that's 100% fair, for sure. This is an awesome start, right? Like, it makes the movement perhaps inconsistent. There's a large degree of influence that's given to privileged gatekeepers. This is often ineffective, either because your advocacy is heavily watered down or because companies take advantage of this in performative ways, and it often spreads misinformation. Fantastic. Excellent job. Okay, cool. Okay. Fourth thing we're going to chat about, and this section is very quick because I have a longer series of notes that I'm going to include in the resource doc, and I want to be able to get the stuff on like arguing about social justice and debate, but super quickly, some stuff on environmentalism. The kind of first thing I'd quickly say is, in most cases, people know what the problems are environmentally: climate change, deforestation, ocean acidification, stuff like that, etc. But I think that's often phrased or framed as a future issue. Just as a quick rhetorical piece of advice, like, I don't think that, especially at this day and age, people need to be like, climate change will have devastating effects. Like, yes, it will have devastating effects. It is having devastating effects. Just to look at Europe right now. So just as a rhetorical piece of advice, I think that it's totally fair game to be like, climate change is really bad right now, right here, right now. We should do something about it. A few quick things on the environmental movement and environmental advocacy. I think the first thing I'd say is that there's a lot of things that make environmental advocacy different from other types of advocacy, which are often important things to think about when it comes to making arguments about environmental advocacy and debate. The two big ones I'd frame is, the first thing is that climate change very often is a hard issue to combat globally because there's a massive collective action problem. And what that basically means is that if I'm an individual country, if I, for example, want to solve climate change, the problem is that I alone can't solve climate change. The problem then is that if I take measures that try to solve my contribution to climate change, what ends up happening is that I bear the costs of those measures, like, for example, increased gas prices, but all countries benefit roughly equally. So the game theoretic problem with combating climate change is that no one country really has the sufficient degree of incentive to become involved in combating climate change and even other environmental issues that are cross-border, because given the global nature of climate change that demands a global response, that global response is often lacking. The second other big issue that comes up, especially and uniquely with environmental advocacy, is that environmental degradation is very oftentimes something that counterintuitively is sometimes hard to pitch to people as a top priority voting issue. Lots of the people that have the most political influence are often quite old. And in case you guys didn't know this, old people die not that far away because they're old. And when old people die, they don't care what happens to them that much after they die. And that means that oftentimes the demographic that has the most influence over politics is also the demographic that has the least reason to care about climate change. But the other issue relating to that is that counterintuitively, even as temperatures go up and even as sea levels rise, it's often very difficult to credibly convince people that A, this is something that you should be voting on, and B, it's often somewhat difficult for people to see the immediate impact. And I know that sounds weird, but unlike other issues that are more flashpoint issues, like, for example, a clear instance of police brutality, what's often tricky with environmental advocacy is that even as temperatures go up, it's not like on any one day you would wake up and say, this is climate change. Well, liberal people would, but lots of conservatives wouldn't. And so the issue that often comes up is how do you convince people who are climate skepticists or people who are not fully on board, even if they agree that climate change is man-made, that it's a high priority issue, convincing people that this is really a big fucking deal is often quite difficult. There's also other reasons why climate change is a kind of funky issue to deal with. For one thing is that climate change is a unique instance where environmental movements are not only trying to convince governments, corporations, and individuals to change their behavior, they're also trying to solve a lacking capacity problem. And what I mean by that is this. Think for a second about most movements that are focused on social or class or identity-based forms of discrimination. In most instances, basically what more or less is happening is that there are active structures of oppression that we're trying to get rid of. Like, for example, there is a law banning abortion. We're trying to get rid of that law. Or there are, for example, active social norms that discourage women from, for example, pursuing careers. We're trying to get rid of those social norms. In very many instances, though, in the context of climate change, we're not just trying to say, fix climate change or stop deforestation. In order to do those things, we often need to invent entirely new technologies or build entirely new energy grids. And so the issue of environmental activism is not just that we're trying to change the incentives of governments or the incentives of companies or the incentives of individuals. We're also trying to change what they're even capable of in the first place. The other kind of common issue that comes up in environmental debates is that it's often not even clear what the solutions are. And that's not to say that the solutions are clear for other things, like, for example, housing discrimination, let's say in the context of BLM, but it's also very, very unclear what the best strategies for approaching environmental crises are. There's a few ways that the international community has tried to approach these crises. The first is through international environmental accords. There's two dominant standards or models that tend to be used for this. The first is what's known as the Paris Climate Accord, and the second is what's known as the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Climate Accord was signed in December of 2015 under the Obama administration, played a role in negotiating in France, but it has, I think at this point, 197, I want to say, signatories, and it's the currently sort of reigning / prevailing international climate agreement. The Kyoto Protocol was established more in the mid-late 1990s and was never signed by the United States. The two major differences between Paris and Kyoto, by the way, Kyoto's in Japan. Paris is a non-binding climate accord, which basically means that countries set their own targets and nothing happens if they don't meet those targets. And the Kyoto Protocol, by comparison, legally bound countries to established emission targets. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't really mean that much, but what it does mean is that at the level of individual governments, when you sign yourself up to be a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, when you do not hit your emissions targets, you have, within the realm of domestic law, you are seen to have failed to satisfy a legally binding target. To be clear, this doesn't mean the international community sanctions you, but it can mean that you can get sued in domestic courts, which is a kind of big deal. The second difference is that the Paris Climate Accord, given its voluntary nature, encourages all countries to participate, including developing economies. Comparatively, Kyoto was much more lenient towards developing economies. This became a really big area of dispute involving the United States because the US was very irked that China was given, at least comparatively, less intense climate standards because it was deemed a developing country. Is there anything else on the slide that I think we should cover? Oh yeah, so the main argument for, like, counterintuitively, it sounds weird why you would want to have a non-binding climate accord, but the kind of main argument for it is just that lots of countries are very reluctant to restrict their own sovereignty and enter into highly binding climate agreements. And that's also especially because very large countries like the United States and China are responsible for the vast majority of global emissions. And perhaps the best way to overcome that collective action problem is to give other countries a credible guarantee that when you do things that are good for the environment, other countries will as well. There's a couple of reasons that's easier on paper than in practice, but the most important of them are the fact that governments tend to be quite short-term, the fact that oil companies have a huge amount of political influence over governments through lobbying, the fact that, like I mentioned before, there's a huge collective action problem at play, and the fact that in very many instances, even when people care about the environment, governments aren't willing to invest into things like green tech because they don't know for sure that they're going to get a positive outcome. And even if they did know for sure they were going to get a positive outcome, it's often the case that people and voters just care more about the immediate proximate things in their lives, like their day-to-day job or their access to good, high-quality education. That's a lot of reasons why it's not that easy to fix climate change as opposed to, you might want it to be in debate. We'll talk about this when we talk about radicalism, but this is a good example of what's called eco-terrorism. Eco-terrorism is basically a practice of more or less using property destruction, civil disobedience, and more violent forms of activism that seek to destroy carbon-intensive infrastructure. So this looks like, for example, putting spikes within the base of trees, which make it basically impossible for traditional logging machinery to cut down those trees, but it can, in more intense instances, look like things like blowing up oil rigs or attempting to sabotage corporate machinery. There's a really fun motion that was set at the Yale College tournament 2 years ago about indigenous activists using vigilante methods of eco-terrorism against logging and mining companies in the Amazon that are increasingly approaching upon. I can't talk today. Encroaching upon their territory. It's called eco-terrorism. We'll debate it in a second. Okay, that is social justice abstract theory stuff I wanted to cover. Before I move on to chat more specifically about applications of this into debate, any questions on like historical context for movements or like general big picture stuff? Okay, I will assume not. Wow, someone must have the wrong number that has texted me. Are you okay? Long time no see. Do you miss me? I have no clue who you are, person. What's the funniest thing I could text back? Yeah, I have no clue. If anyone has funny ideas for how I can respond, that would be entertaining. I'll have a meme with that, don't worry. Okay.
Just say like, that's bonkers, man. I have no idea who you are.
Yeah, but that's not funny. I gotta have like a funny response, like, I'm trying to think of like yeah, Jeffrey.
What if you respond with the word eco-terrorism?
That'd be pretty good. That'd be pretty good. What if I responded with like a massive treatise on like social justice theory, just like, am I okay? Yes, I'm okay. I've been reading all about queer Marxist theory on property allocation. Anyways, two things we're going to chat about within the realm of debating social justice. Oh my God, I'm so sorry for having stock things like that. I'm really sorry. But anyways, we're going to talk about, first of all, we're going to talk about stock material in social justice debates. And then we're going to talk about increasing trends in characterizing social movements. Before I get into any of this, there's just one quick thing I want to preface. The sad reality of high school debating is that almost all social justice motions, as sad as this is, are almost all the same. They're just the same clash hidden in like 17 different motions. And what I mean when I say that is that in lots of instances, when tournaments set social justice motions, they'll basically set one of like the three same debates. They'll set this house as a social justice movement would embrace a radical strategy over a moderate strategy. This house as a social justice movement would embrace something that is probably in line with the ideology of a movement, but is maybe bad for the political optics of the movement. And then sometimes you'll have motions that are about like implementing policies that are good or bad for a marginalized group and whether or not they're actually going to be good. That third type is the trickiest, I think, to debate about because that's where there's the most variability. But those first two types of motions have a lot of stock material that show up again and again and again. So what is that stock material? What is everyone's favorite middle school argument, guys? What is everyone's favorite argument? That's right, it's backlash. Everyone loves backlash arguments. JK, I don't like them. Backlash is the whole like, ew, why would we do that? People aren't gonna like it. Ew. There's a few ways that you can make these arguments a little bit more interesting whenever you make them. First, I think that you always want to make sure that your backlash arguments are comparative. So instead of just being like, oh, conservatives will dislike that. Like, well, yeah, but they're probably going to like dislike anything BLM says. Be at least remotely comparative and be like, oh, here is actually why X group of people will be comparatively more opposed to a movement on your side compared to under our side. Additionally, I think that you also want to try to avoid using the word backlash as a verb. I'm really sorry if there are any West Coasters on the call right now, but West Coasters in the US sometimes do this, and I get why you do it. It saves words, but like no rational human being ever uses the word backlash as a verb. Like these people will backlash against. No, like that's not a. Who says that? Like no one says that. So try sounding like a real human being as opposed to a debate robot when making backlash arguments. And I also just think in general, the best thing that you can do when making backlash arguments is try to make them arguments that turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. So what do I mean by that? The idea is if you can say, look, backlash is almost always perception-based. It's based on what people perceive to be true, not what is actually true, right? But if you can say something like, look, when this policy is first implemented, people are going to perceive this policy in a bad way. And as a consequence of that, whatever the underlying perception is, maybe it's false, it eventually ends up becoming true because people don't engage with the policy. So let me give you a little bit of a, kind of like clearer example of what that might look like, right? Let's say you have a motion like, this House believes that the United States should implement a policy of open borders. OP makes an argument about backlash, and they say there's going to be an enormous amount of right-wing populist backlash against this. You're going to see the rise of demagoguery type figures like Trump times 10. There's going to be a massive switch towards the political right, and that is harmful because those right-wing candidates will end up implementing policies that are bad for marginalized groups, right? Well, the implicit premise of your argument is a perception argument. Your argument basically is that it would be really, really bad to have open borders because people will perceive migrants or perceive immigrants as being risky people to accept. They'll perceive them as being poor. They'll perceive them in bad ways. And that is incorrect. But if people vote in a bunch of really racist, scumbaggy right-wing governments, all of a sudden, from the perspective of a right-wing voter, if you have a bunch of governments across the United States that start giving these people less welfare, that start giving them less state support, that start giving them less education, that lock them out from accessing things like educational opportunities, suddenly, when you look at what's happening to the world, you see all these immigrants who are becoming poorer, who are becoming more desolate. And from the perspective of a racist right-wing conservative, the original fear you had suddenly became true. It became realized that we are suddenly accepting a bunch of whatever unsavory, poor immigrants into our country. And to be clear, that's wrong. But the idea is that if backlash ends up creating the conditions necessary to legitimize or realize that underlying issue of perception, that often makes backlash arguments perception arguments or turns backlash arguments from just arguments about perception into arguments about people actively retaliating against what reality happens to be. So how do you structure backlash arguments? I think that you generally want to say, who's going to dislike this policy? Why will they dislike this policy? Why will they dislike this policy more than they would have disliked whatever the status quo is? And what is the tangible impact of that? Now, whenever you're going up against backlash arguments, I have a doc, so I won't spend time on this, but there's a bunch of obvious and quick responses you can often give to backlash arguments. Backlash often fades, people move on, and we stop caring about things. Remember, we have the attention span of a dolphin. Backlash is often going to happen anyway. We can often rationalize why policies are good. And in very many instances, backlash is just not not a sufficiently intense enough harm to outweigh all the good things that a policy can do. Second very common argument you'll hear about in almost all social justice debates are arguments about political palatability. The idea of being palatable is basically how can you as a movement strive to be moderate enough that people view your movement as being credible? How do people view your movement as being reasonable, rational, non-threatening enough that they're willing to vote for you, vote for your candidates, vote for your policies, attend your marches, your rallies, etc. Now, whenever you're making arguments about trying to make movements appear palatable, it's often really useful to frame your arguments in terms of media coverage. I think that's often overlooked how many people interact with social movements indirectly using the media as a proxy. And what I mean by that is lots of people interact with social movements, not by, say, directly going to a protest or by having an exhaustive conversation with an activist. They often interact with social movements through the nightly news programs they watch or their Twitter feed. So the way that the media covers movements is often highly, highly important when it comes to getting people to buy into movements. So we'll kind of use like a stock-ish example of this, and I think you guys can kind of know what I'm getting at here. But oops, that was awkward. Let's say you have a motion, something like this. This House believes the Black Lives Matter movement should prioritize reform-based narratives, like, for example, we should like reform the police, over abolition-based narratives, like, for example, we should, abolish we should abolish prisons or, abolish the police. So if we're on Gov, we're obviously going to end up making an argument that is what? The obvious Gov argument that we're going to end up making, basically, is that this makes the movement appear more palatable. So I'm going to have you guys collectively do two things. First, I want us to figure out why does this make the movement appear more palatable? I know it sounds trivial, but we're going to prove it. And then we're going to try to prove why is it good for the movement to be perceived or sort of portrayed as moderate / palatable. Can't type. Okay, so I know it sounds trivial, but why would it be the case that the movement would appear more palatable if it advocated for reform over abolition? Anyone can shout out ideas if you have them. Yeah, Jacqueline.
It's more accepting to like other people, so they're less likely to like oppose it, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So there's less likely to be backlash against this, all of that. Janet has a fantastic, well, I'm gonna say this too. My computer did something weird there. This is closer to the status quo. So there's simply, we need to do less work convincing people because we're simply just getting closer, right? Like we are closer towards reform than we are to abolition. And therefore it's easier to justify advocating for this. Other idea, I mean, this is kind of trivial, but like, basically that's the main gist of it. Celine.
Yeah, I think in addition to the fact it's like closer to the status quo, just kind of adding on, like the reason that we are reformed is that like we're trying to go against the other side. Like other side, they like the current status quo, or we're trying to convince them that we need to do something else. So rather than abolish it, like adding something onto it is just more palatable because you're not really completely changing it.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe we can say, for one thing, people just like the status quo. They like things like, for example, the police, at least white people might, for example. But maybe on top of that, perhaps there's a powerful argument that could be made that is like, look, we're not trying to get rid of the police. We're trying to make the police better, as opposed to we are trying to outright get rid of the police in the very, first instance, et cetera. Yeah. So maybe you, for example, can say things like, people have very legitimate, fears over outright abolition, and the amount of airtime that would be required to defeat those, or the ability to defeat those arguments, is very, very much in doubt. So the kind of implication of all of this, right, basically, is just, the implication basically is just like, this makes the movement optically appear / be perceived as more moderate, right? The question then becomes, why is it better for the movement to be perceived as moderate? Anyone want to offer up some ideas? Yeah, Jeffrey.
It'll garner more support.
Yeah, so the obvious reason is that you just get more, oops, wrong place, Ryan. You just get more support, right? That means more people marching. That means more people voting. It means that you just get, a greater degree of support from politicians, presumably from corporations. That's basically the main gist. And just to complete the argument, why do we care about more support? This is a really trivial link. It's not a trick question, I promise. But like, why do we care about more people supporting the movement?
Effectiveness.
Yeah, it basically means that we just kind of increase the, political efficacy of the movement. It basically means that we're more able to kind of get change, for sure. Okay. Good job, folks. Excellently well done. Okay, next thing. Most people have an easy time arguing for moderate or moderation within political or social advocacy. People are often not as comfortable advocating for the radical side of things. So whenever you have a motion that requires you to defend the radical side, it's often useful to actually lean in and not lean in like lean in feminism, lean in like embrace the radical aspect of whatever you're advocating for and make arguments for why being radical is good. So there's a couple of stock arguments that are often run for why being radical is good. The probably two most common ones that we hear, though, are basically that, A, when you engage in radical activism, you energize the most intensely supportive members of your movement. So what that basically means is that within any sort of social movement, there might be, broadly speaking, two big groups of people. There's some group of people who are moderate supporters, and they obviously care about your movement. But the second group of people is the group of people who like care incredibly intensely about the movement, about its goals, its priorities. They're affected very intimately. And the argument you can make oftentimes is that when you embrace radical advocacy and ideology, you often energize and sort of invigorate those hardliners. And it means that those people feel more included in the movement, and they're more likely to then double down on advocacy work. And those are the most important groups of people to focus on, because they're the people who are going to do the nitty gritty, really intense, hard effort things that are required to accomplish real change. The second main argument you'll hear in support of radicalism is that being radical helps to do what's called shift the Overton window, which basically means that if you have some degree of advocacy, which is presently moderate, some people will perceive even moderate liberal advocacy as extreme. But if you have a more radical thing to benchmark it against, like, for example, Martin Luther King being compared to Malcolm X during the civil rights movement, it's an easier pill to swallow when you're shifting the goalposts and trying to understand why that, moderate advocacy actually is moderate. There's some other reasons that I've listed here. You can read about them later. But the kind of like example that we're going to kind of work with is the one that we talked about a little bit earlier, which basically is, I'll skip to a new page here. Basically, this house believes, this house believes that environmental movements should embrace eco-terrorism. So, for example, like property destruction that sort of tries to destroy carbon polluting infrastructure. So let's say we're on Gov here. We're obviously defending the more radical side. Why might it be a good thing to embrace eco-terrorism? Why might there be benefits to eco-terrorism possibly? I know it's a stock motion, but it's not a horrible thing to debate stock motions sometimes. Any ideas that folks want to float out? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You can kind of just say like, there is currently not the political or really any sort of capital to make effective change through systems. So in order to get any sort of effective change, it has to come through, eliminating the coal plants or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe we can just, take the stance that says it's very difficult to get alternative measures of change. This is probably the best way to do it. Obviously, yeah, you're right, Emily. You got it. We can kind of do the, energizes hardliners. We can do the, Overton window. So we can say that other demands look a little bit more reasonable. You got it. Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
I guess it could like bypass legislation, whereas like if like there are many eco-terrorists, like companies will see these eco-terrorists and be like, oh my gosh, like I can't like build pipelines because eco-terrorists are gonna like destroy them. So they'll stop. Well, they won't stop, but they'll build less.
Oops, what am I doing? Oh, there we go. Yeah, so maybe we can say that this changes the incentive to corporations. They're less likely to engage in environmentally damaging behaviors, for sure. And because there's an economic disincentive from doing so. Yeah, Janet, go ahead.
Okay, this might be another far-fetched argument, but like basically like the people who are most likely going to be like really into eco-terrorism are probably going to be like the people who are most affected by like the changing climate, which means that they're probably going to be like the most marginalized, or like they're probably more likely to be like marginalized people. And so when they embrace eco-terrorism, it puts a spotlight on these people that actually like embrace it, right? And so that means that like these issues are getting more attention. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Absolutely right. We can even make another, version of that argument, which just says that generically, this probably increases media attention. Sure, this is controversial, but that's exactly why the media starts covering this and talking about it. Yeah, Jared, go ahead.
Could you also say something sort of characterizing the fact that the environmental movement is largely going to be one of, if not the most diluted types of movement, because there's such a quote unquote activism as like not using plastic straws or turning off lights and stuff, which is ultimately ineffective. But whenever you prioritize things like eco-terrorism, it means that the image of like overall what the movement wants and how they plan on going about it, focusing the pressure more on emissions by corporations and countries, gets sort of more crystallized in the public view, because you sort of eliminate that low barrier to entry, like I turned off my light, hooray, sort of thing.
Yeah, so this kind of combats the kind of dominant narratives of like, for example, individual people should embrace responsibility, yada yada, for sure. So this is fantastic, right? And like this is like a really nice outline of just how you can go about making arguments on eco-terrorism. Very nice job. Good job, folks. Good job. You guys picked this up quick. Okay, next thing, internal division. This is an argument that I think doesn't get made nearly enough, but I want to quickly start by explaining why this matters before I explain what it is. I think that there's kind of a really clever way that you, especially in VP debates, there's a really cool way that you can try to win VP debates very easily, even out of opening, which is basically to say that there's a hidden gem of an argument in every single social justice debate round you ever do, which is basically that no matter what the motion is calling for, its success or efficacy is almost always hung on activists engaging with the advocacy fruitfully. It is hung on activists feeling connected to the movement. And the power of any movement is always derived from the people within the movement feeling like the movement represents them and their ideologies, and therefore doing the things that actually cause change to happen: marches, rallies, protests, lobbying, strikes, those types of things. So if you can ever make arguments that prove that movements as a whole become more divided, become more fragmented, become more, excuse me, more incapable of just working, then anything that a movement could possibly ever do almost immediately falls out the window, right? So you can make arguments oftentimes about how if movements embrace something, which is very controversial internally within the movement, regardless of whether it's good externally, regardless of whether it's in line with the principles of a movement, whenever you embrace these types of very controversial policies, it often alienates a lot of people within your movement, and that often results in internal fragmentation. It means that time, resources, money, etc., are wasted, and it means that your movement's perception becomes substantially worsened. And the reason that you can say all this matters is that the more that movements are dominated by infighting as opposed to productive external lobbying or negotiation, the less change is able to actually happen, and the worse off a movement becomes, the point at which you embrace very controversial ideology or policy. So, for example, if you have a motion like, this House believes that feminists should heavily advocate against the institution of marriage, there's a pretty reasonable op claim that could say, look, maybe Gov is right and marriage is antithetical to the principles of feminism. We'll contest that later, but let's say it's true. It doesn't really matter, because not only will there be backlash against this, the point is that there's a huge number of women who won't support this policy. There's a huge number of feminists who will not want to identify as feminists if the image of feminism is now associated with being opposed to marriage. And so now, instead of feminism focusing on real issues like combating the gender wage gap or focusing on real pressing issues of sexual harassment, what maybe instead just ends up happening to a very large extent is that you get very little progress and very little change because the movement becomes defined by its internal infighting. So if you, for example, have a motion like, this House regrets the ideological dominance of left-wing or leftism within feminism, you might make arguments really on either side of the House about why any one ideology having a particular hegemony within the feminist movement is bad to the extent that it alienates voices of the opposing political spectrum and makes them less inclined to engage with feminism internally. The fifth very generic type of argument that comes up in a lot of debates about social justice is basically arguments about commercialization, which basically is more or less when companies sort of integrate social messaging into their branding. And there's a lot of reasons companies do that. It's profitable. They don't want to get canceled. Does anyone want to give me an example of like what commercialization of social justice campaigns might look like, or what this might look like in terms of examples or illustrations? Yeah, Pride Month, exactly. Yep. Like there's a bunch of memes that'll always happen about that. Yeah, Janet.
Oh no, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
Oh, my bad. But yeah, it's like, the classic example is like Pride Month. Like a bunch of companies on May 31st will be totally homophobic, and then June 1st will roll around and they'll literally be spouting all the colors of the rainbow. So, it happens quite a lot. It's a pretty kind of common dominant norm, and it's certainly something that happens quite a good chunk of the time. So Lego having a rainbow set. Dove's Everyone is Beautiful campaign is kind of another example of this. Again, on face, there's nothing wrong with this, but if you're Dove, it's not like Dove actually is endorsing feminist theory. Dove is doing this because they know it sells and it's going to make them money, and that's why they endorse this type of real beauty campaign. So you can obviously make arguments and debate around about why commercialization is good or bad. And also, as another note, this is kind of one of the interesting arguments why being palatable is either good or bad, depending on perspective. So the more palatable your movement is, the more likely corporations are to publicly adopt narratives from your movement and sort of incorporate them into advertising or incorporate them into branding. And comparatively, the more radical that your movement is, the less likely movements are to actively, or the less likely corporations, are to sort of embrace messaging that comes from socially progressive leftist organizations. And then you can obviously make arguments about why that might be good or bad. Classic arguments why commercialization is good. The biggest argument by far is awareness, visibility, discourse, discussion, media coverage. Basically, just having corporations, which are very socially influential actors, publicly get on board with your movement and publicly support things like gay rights or support things like, for example, feminism, has a lot of benefits in terms of catharsis, in terms of actively spotlighting these movements and making them appear less fringe. The common arguments that you'll hear against commercialization basically is just that this is really fake AF. Corporations obviously are oftentimes very bad actors to be co-opting this type of progressive messaging. And perhaps more importantly, they often embrace the most watered down and often non-intersectional conceptions of social advocacy. If I'm a corporation, I'm trying to sell shit, and I'm not going to sell shit if I advocate for really radical but truly sort of groundbreaking or barrier pushing types of advocacies. And given that corporations do often crowd out other activists, there's often a harm that comes as a consequence. The last type of stock argument we'll chat about really quickly is just kind of cancel culture and debate. Honestly, this doesn't come up a lot, but whenever it comes up, it can always be good to think about. Classic arguments why cancel culture is good. I think the most chronically underrated argument, by the way, in any debate about social justice ever, always think about how social justice motions affect activists themselves and how activists or progressives or people within movements themselves get impacted in some way by emotion. So for example, you can make an argument on any sort of motion about eco-terrorism that's like the people who engage in eco-terrorism might just find some degree of meaning in it. Even if, like, as the rest of us were like, they fuck, like some people just do. You could for example, there's a motion that got set a while back that was like, there's a group of like animal rights organizations that will basically do this thing where they basically will break into like animal enclosures, like for example, factories that mass produce and slaughter meat animals like chickens, and they'll take a bunch of pictures, which is illegal otherwise, and they'll basically like hightail it out of there with like a bunch of chickens and stuff in their arms, like they'll like literally just like try to save chickens and stuff. And like I know that it sounds like a stupid argument, but if you're having a debate about whether those organizations are net good or net bad, like there's just an argument that can be made that's like there's just some extent to which the people who do that find an enormous amount of catharsis and just knowing they're making the world even the tiniest bit better off. Anyways, back to cancel culture. Arguments as to why it's good to
I do have a
some.
question.
Oh yeah, go
about
ahead.
That one. How do you weigh that? Why should we care about what the activists feel?
Yeah, I think the easiest way that you can weigh it is uncertainty. So when I say that, what I basically mean is it's very uncertain in any social justice debate whether or not we're going to radically change society, whether we're going to increase or decrease the political capital of a movement. At that point, the most certain impact in a lot of debates is just the impact on activists. The second reason why you weigh impacts to activists heavily is because the sort of like emotional well-being or the sort of willingness of activists to engage in further displays of activism, that is dependent on them sort of, being sufficiently engaged with the movement and sufficiently happy with the progress the movement has made to continue doing good stuff, right? Like activist burnout is a very real thing. And I think that one of the least commonly discussed impacts of backlash isn't just bad because generically racist people become racist. The other impact is that it is really exhausting for someone who works on and fights for social justice campaigns to every single day be harassed, to be shouted at, to be slammed down. And there's a lot of impacts that just has on the morale of social movements and their internal ability to get any form of change, whether specified in the motion or not. So you can often make arguments about why we care about activists because the impacts toward activists is always upstream of any other impact in the debate. In other words, the impact that something has on activists is what logically flows prior to any other argument you might make in a debate round. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of like cancel culture, kind of other classic arguments for why cancel culture good, it reinforces accountability. There's a degree to which it at least causes the media to talk about issues of inequality and discrimination. And in some instances, it can be used effectively by social movements, either as a tool for going against very powerful individuals or as a tool for shifting the Overton window. Classic arguments for why cancel culture is bad. One of the interesting frames that I like to kind of talk about sometimes in debate rounds is I think there can often be a very cool argument you can make about who actually engages in certain types of practices. And what you can oftentimes make an interesting argument on is that in lots of cases, the people who engage in the most intense displays of activism are counterintuitive to what I said before, not necessarily the most vulnerable members of movements. In some cases, the people who engage in the most bluntly extreme displays of progressivism are sometimes white allies or privileged allies of movements who are just attempting to performatively display their, I wrote wokeness, but more so what I mean, to put it in like a less blunt way, is they're more or less trying to one up other activists by showing that they are even more dedicated to the movement, even if that means they have to really put themselves out there and advocating for really, 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 hardcore ideas or policies or whatever. So you can kind of make interesting arguments about why things like pushback culture, call out culture often end up becoming problematic, not because the intrinsic idea of cancel culture is bad, but because the sort of race to the bottom between different allies who often don't necessarily have the best of incentives often results in sort of this, race to the bottom effect. You can also run all of the other classic conservative talking point arguments for why cancel culture is bad. Okay. Those are some like generic stocky type argument things that come up in debate. I know that we're kind of a little bit running out of time. So the kind of like last thing we'll chat about tonight, and then we'll get to the Kahoot, is just kind of general trends and broad things within social movements that are good to be aware of. And you can kind of use this when characterizing social movements and making arguments about movements. The first thing is that lots of movements nowadays are becoming increasingly dependent on, or at least rely increasingly upon, social media. So at this point, more people use Facebook than there are adherents of Christianity. And that means that social media has an enormously large number of people that can be reached very, very quickly by activists. That being said, I think that the best argument, at least in my personal opinion, for why social media has upside is that perhaps one of the best reasons for social media's benefit to social progressivism is just that social media is a very useful tool for circumventing other forms of state repression. So if nothing else, it's easier to do things like, for example, form support networks or support structures on, say, Facebook communities, or even on platforms like Twitter or whatnot, when you have access to things like the internet or to, social media, even in nations that otherwise would have restricted conventional media or conventional movements from ever arising or talking about progressive issues. Now, the obvious response most people would have to that is like, but don't those countries control social media? And that's obviously true, but it does to some extent underestimate the effect that things like VPNs can have on people's access to social media and the like. In terms of making arguments against the value of social media in social movements, oftentimes you can make the arguments we made before. You oftentimes promote very watered down conceptions of activism. You always are subject and sort of beholden to very privileged gatekeepers. And on top of that, like sort of Jared, I think you had mentioned this argument before, social media can often make movements somewhat inconsistent in the context of people display large amounts of support for movements on social media when it's trendy and when it's flashy. But once the trend shifts and once flashy things become something else, that's when that movement dies out on social media. So trend number one, lots of movements are increasingly using social media. Trend number two, there is an increasing movement within a lot of social campaigns towards youth activism. That's well represented by, for example, Greta. But obviously, you can kind of like talk, about why this affects, for example, the types of advocacies that movements push for, and stuff like that. I have a case on this that I'm going to include in the notes that I send out tomorrow. So I'll kind of attach more exhaustive notes on kind of like general, ways of, kind of approaching this type of debate and stuff like that. But, the gist is basically there's lots of good arguments for why youth activism is good. These people are often devoted to the cause a lot. They're empathetic. They're often very, very good at identifying what's wrong. And I think the sort of best argument for youth activism is like, in lots of cases, like literally no one else is going to argue for things. So classic example of that is like school mascots. Lots of school mascots are racist AF. And in many instances, the initial impetus to reform those types of things, at least internally within school boards, comes from, you guessed it, students. The last big trend I want to chat about, and again, you can kind of read more about this afterwards if you want, because I think it's a really interesting thing to read about. There's an increasing trend within a lot of social movements to decentralize power and to move away from hierarchy. So what this looks like, especially in the era of social media, is that lots of movements nowadays don't per se have recognizable figureheads. So for example, if you think of a movement like MeToo or even BLM, there are obviously some people who are more powerful or who might be more generally associated with those movements, right? But it's often the case that you wouldn't look at a lot of social movements and say like, oh, she is the head of feminism, or like this person is the head of the LGBTQ movement. And it's not as if that's really ever existed in society. It would be a lie to say that movements in the past have been exclusively centralized, but there is a general trend within social movements towards becoming increasingly diffuse. This can often affect the types of arguments you make, because you can often make arguments about how, for example, a certain narrative might interact with a very decentralized structure of a movement. And you can obviously also make independent arguments about why the decentralized or centralized nature of movements could be good or bad. You can make arguments, for example, about why leaders can sort of focus the efforts and resources of movements, and why movements like Occupy Wall Street, for example, often die out because of that lack of directionality. At the same time, there's also reasons why movements, when they are decentralized, might be able to access certain benefits, like a greater diversity of internal thought and less susceptibility to a specific figurehead being caught up in scandal and the like. So those are kind of some of like the big kind of common arguments you can make for/against centralizing economic or certain economic, political or social power within the hands of a small number of leaders and stuff like that. So that is the stuff in presentation. Any folks want to ask questions about that before we chat about Kahoot type stuffs? Anyone want to have like any of that seem kind of confusing to folks, or any questions that folks want to ask about making those types of arguments, etc.? Damn, we're all experts. Very exciting. Okay, I'm going to shut recording off in that case.